Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we are going to take a look at the ArrayList class. We're going to see how an array list differs from a regular array and talk a little bit about collections in general. So for this particular demo, what we're going to do is we're going to collect some information from the user and store it in an array list and then ultimately print it back out to the user. So before we get started, let's go ahead and create a function signature. We're going to add it down here to the list of our demos. We'll again start off with the public static void. We do not expect a return argument for this demo, and we are going to simply call it ArrayListWithStringsDemo. And likewise, it does not expect to have any input arguments. We're going to capture everything from the command line, and we're going to do so inside the function. And so before we forget, let's go ahead and add our comment block that we can fill out later on. And we'll put a brief description of what we plan to do inside this function. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create an array list to store strings captured from the user on the command line. And more importantly, our goal here is to see the differences or some of the differences with arrays. If you recall from the earlier video that we focused on arrays, we had to know beforehand how big the array was going to be, or we had to take responsibility for resizing it. You'll see there's a different approach when we are dealing with array lists. So let's go ahead and get started creating some of our helper objects that we're going to need. As I said earlier, we're going to be collecting the information from the command line, so we're going to need a java.util.scanner, and we might as well go ahead and declare it and also initialize it here. So there's going to be a new java.util.scanner. And remember that we're going to leverage then our system.in, and that is our command line, but the input stream of our command line. The second thing that we're going to need is a temporary or rather local variable that will allow for us to store the individual response from the user when we prompt them for a question. This is before we ultimately evaluate what that response is. And we will again keep this simple. And we will simply just call this a response. And you can go ahead and initialize that response to an empty set of quotes. That's just a 0-length string. Now for the new object that we have yet to see, and that is going to be in our array list. And specifically, you'll notice here that an array list requires an additional argument to fully describe it. And that E refers to the type of data that is going to be stored in our array list. Now, you can presume that if we're collecting a string in the form of a response from a user, that we're probably going to want to store it in an array list of strings. And so to identify that, you simply specify that we want to have a java.lang.string for our array list type. And we will simply call this one responses, note the S, and we can go ahead and not only declare it, but we can go ahead and initialize it here. So we have our java.util.ArrayList. And again, we're going to use the longhand notation here and simply specify again what type of array list we are trying to construct. So java.lang.string. But then on the right side of the equal sign, we need to run the constructor. So we follow this up with a set of curly braces, and what this, excuse me, a set of parentheses. And what this does is this runs the this creates a new array list, and it already constructs it. All right, so a couple of additional variables that we'll add later on. What we need to do now is set up some sort of mechanism to loop to see what information we're going to provide from the user, and to continue providing the information from the user. We want to collect at least one piece of information from the user. So we have a couple of options on how to do this, and we're going to keep with a while loop to accomplish this. And so we need some sort of flag, which we will make a Boolean. And we're simply going to call it continue, and we're going to initialize it as true. And so this will allow for us to set up our while loop by simply saying while continue equal to true. And then we are going to collect information from the user and store it, looking for a special keyword to exit the loop. Well, first thing that we want to do is provide some sort of prompt to the user. So we're going to again use our system.out.println with some simple instructions. And we're going to essentially just collect strings, but we'll call them names here. So please enter a name. And then we're going to follow this up with the collection and storage in the response variable of the string from the scanner dot next line. And so if you recall, the next line function captures everything up to the new line character in the command prompt. So basically anything the user type in at our prompt will simply be stored as a string. Now, we're not going to do any validation or anything like that in this example here, but this is going to capture and return a string. And then we need a way of exiting out of the loop, because otherwise this is going to run continuously. And so the easiest thing to do is to have the user enter in some sort of keyword. So please enter in a name or exit. And so the idea here is that we are going to check to see if the response in the individual response equals ignore case, our special keyword of exit. And if that is in fact true, then all we do is we simply change our flag to false. And then under the else branch, what we want to do is now add the response to the responses array list. Now, before, when we were dealing with arrays, this would involve checking the size of the array, seeing if we still had room, tracking the index of the array, and then possibly resizing it as necessary. In this case, we don't have to go through any of those steps. We simply leverage our responses array list. And if you take a look at some of the methods associated with it, you'll see the very first one allows for us to add an object. And specifically in this case, because we have identified this as an array list of strings, we can add a string. So all we have to do is simply say responses.add and the latest response from the user. And that's it. As you can see, significantly easier to deal with than an array. Now, again, there are proper uses of an array. And also, if you look under the hood with an array list, you'll discover that it is fundamentally an array underneath. These are just convenience methods that allow for this process to be a lot simpler. Well, what we'd like to do now is like to see how to access the individual elements in an array list. Well, to do that, we need to go ahead and declare another local variable. In this case, we're just going to simply call it index. And what we're going to do now is we're going to set up a for loop that allows for us to navigate through our array list starting at 0. So for index equals to 0, index less than our responses dot, and you'll see that we have a method that returns the size of the array list. In this case, we want to use less than because we want to stop one less element before the end of the array or the size of the array, because remember that Java is 0 based. So in other words, if there are 10 responses in our array list, we want to go from 0 to 9. And then lastly, index plus plus. Now, at this point, then what we can do is just have a system.out, and I'm going to go ahead and change this up just a little bit. I'm going to include a printf so we can format this, and I'm going to specify not only the index in the format spec, followed by a %d, but I'm also going to specify the value, which will be a %s, followed by a new line. And so in the first placeholder, what we want to specify is the index, and in the second placeholder, we're going to use our responses, and we're going to use another method, specifically the get method, that will allow for us to get the value at a specific index. Now, at this point, we've come far enough. Let's go ahead and build this. And it seems like we are successful. Let's go ahead and come back to our main. And let's add the ability now to control this from the command line. So we'll add another else if, and our args.length will need to be equal to 1. And our args square brackets 0 dot equals, ignore case, will need to match the array list with strings demo. And if that's equal to true, then we simply want to call our EE333.fundamentals.demo.ArrayListDemo. At this point, let's go ahead and build it again. Let's go out to our command window. We'll run our Java EE333 fundamentals demo. We're going to run our array list with strings demo, and we should get prompted to enter in a name. I'm just going to go ahead and put my name in. I'm going to put a couple of names in. And then when I've had enough, I'm going to type in exit, and it seems like our logic is working correctly. We've bounced out of our while loop, and we are now in our for loop that simply leverages the index from 0 to 3, noticing that the size of the array list is 4. Now, before we leave this particular demo, I'd like to show you an alternate way of accessing the array list. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to deviate slightly from our for loop structure. And so this can be considered more of a classic for loop, in that we've seen this in other languages, particularly in C and C++. But what I'd like to introduce to you is the idea of a for each loop and the idea of an iterator. And this is a great opportunity for us to see the difference, not only in the syntax, but also in the behavior. And so what we can do is we can, again, use our for keyword, but this time around, we're going to use an iterator that is of the same type as the data that's stored in the array list. In this case, it was a string. And so we will simply create a local variable. Java.lang.string will be the type. And I'm going to call it iterator. It's going to be a little bit long, a little bit cumbersome, but ultimately we can come up with better names for this variable later. And then we use the colon notation to specify what it is going to iterate through. So in this case, it's going to iterate through our responses array list. And that's all you need to do. At this point, we can then call our system.out.println, and we can simply print out our iterator. Now, the big disadvantage or distinction with this approach is that we lose the order. In other words, we know the order in which it is stored in the array list. However, we do not have access to the index. In other words, we're not utilizing the index, whichever way you want to think about it. So in other words, if you need to know the position of the current element in the array list, then you probably want to use the classic approach. If you don't care about that and you're simply trying to iterate through each of the elements in the array list, then this second approach will be fine. Now, to distinguish between the two, I want to take just a second. I'm going to throw in a system.out.println and just a barrier between the two. And you can do a new line or some other character. It doesn't really matter. But at this point, we're going to build it again. We'll go out to the command line and we'll run this again. We're going to have to collect a little bit of information. And then finally exit. And you'll see that we have two different ways to be able to enumerate through our array list. So again, hopefully you found this video useful. Hopefully you can see the differences between an array list and array. Again, one is not necessarily better than the other. There will just be opportunities for us to use each of them. I will say that the array list is probably going to be considered slightly more convenient just by virtue of the fact that in addition to adding elements, you can also easily remove elements, etc. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.